Matt, we are so glad to have you at our lecture series. I'm pleased to introduce Matt Hollingsworth, who is the CEO of Carta Healthcare. And so that is a really interesting perspective to bring to this lecture series. Carta is helping healthcare providers improve patient care using insights through the data in providers' IT system. Matt is no stranger to Stanford. He got his MBA here and also studied high energy physics. What are the odds that somebody would do both of those? And he performed his research as part of the team that discovered the Higgs boson. We were just now, for those of you who are listening, deciding that the Higgs boson is the equal sign in E equals MC squared. And he co-founded a startup, Global Dressage Analytics. He proposed London managed projects for DoD. He provided technical leadership for telecom analytics startups, Deepfield, and did project management for various Internet of Things applications for Samsung. But these days, he is going to be telling us about how to transform EMR data and clinical notes into quality improvement at scale. So with that introduction, I turn it over to you, Dr. Hollingsworth.
Thank you so much for the introduction. And great to meet all of you. Thanks for taking the time. As you might have heard from my story, I come from a fairly technical background of sorts, just to sort of caveat that so that some of the things I say may make sense in context, but this will not be a technical talk. So specifically, this is about sort of how do you address the difficulties in using data in a healthcare setting to make improvements. That's really what we'll be talking about.
Yes,
and the primary objective here is to just help everyone who is working in this space, like learn a little bit from the experience that I've had trying to do exactly that, and just hopefully empower you all to make sure that all the great research that's being done at Stanford has a little bit higher chance of getting out there to the real world and making an impact. So that's really the goal at the end of the day here. So to give a little bit of additional background here on my story. So as you heard from the introduction, I've done like the sort of common theme throughout my career has been figure out some way to get access to a difficult to reach data set and derive value from that in one way or another, whether that's as diverse as doing that for discovering a new particle for physics, or what we're doing now, which is using that to make data-driven decisions in healthcare, and everything in between. So I've done a bunch of stuff there, but the real key sort of takeaway here is that I believe very strongly, as sort of the things that I've worked on, that data can be used in a variety of fashions to make things better in one way or another. And it may sound a little weird to go from physics to doing this in medicine, but there's a very important thing for my life that sort of drove me to do that, which is my mom's had cancer 5 times. And the 5th one was while I was at a company called Deepfield, actually right before I came to Stanford to focus on everything that you're about to hear about. That was the first one I'd experienced as an adult. And so I got to see a lot of things that were really interesting to me specifically, and especially at that time, like a lot of the things, this feels naive now, but one of the things that was so mysterious to me throughout that entire ordeal was that what happens with my mom, so 5 cancers and all kinds of other crazy stuff, Chiari malformation, she had her spleen removed when she was 17 because it got huge, like it's just all kinds of horrible stuff that she's had to go through. So she has a impressive looking medical history, and she walks around with a binder of it, several hundred pages long, has all the medications she's been given, she's had 29 surgeries at this point, just really intense medical history. And so as all of you who are not naive on this subject might imagine, when she walks in with that binder and plops it on your desk the first time you've ever seen her, like, you know, people's eyes get wide. They're like, what is this? And like, it's a non-trivial sort of amount of information to download into somebody who is new taking care of my mom. But the interesting thing that I kept seeing was that the picture that I would see play over and over again as she'd walk in, plop down that notebook on the desk, and then the doc would know none of it. They'd spend the rest of the time typing data in the EHR, then in the like 2 minutes that's left, say something, and then she'd be out. And then she'd go to the next doc and repeat. So it's the fact that, so first off, like I get there's a lot to download, but the thing that was really fascinating to me is that story kept repeating and people kept not knowing this stuff, even though it's obviously very important. It's really easy to kill her. She has a crazy cocktail of drugs. Just it was very interesting to naive me that I thought that's what the EHRs were for. And for just people on the street, I think a lot of people also find this interesting. Like, why is it that my experience at a doctor is them typing into a computer the whole time, and yet nobody really knows anything about my history when I go see somebody new? It's really mysterious to people who haven't sort of worked in this space before. And it was mysterious to me at the time. And so I felt like, well, this seems like a nice place that there's a lot of benefit that could be had from analyzing the data here. So, but it's complicated. And so I think it makes sense for me to go and study this very specifically. And that's what brought me to Stanford. So specifically, I came to the business school with a focus in two very specific areas. One is technology transfer. So the idea of taking a sort of deep technology and bring it into the real world. I wanted to really focus on that. And in particular in the healthcare space, because I'd realized early on that the whole healthcare ecosystem is complex enough that if I didn't go back and study it specifically, that I probably wouldn't make any meaningful impact. And so that's what I came to do. And then I met David Schenker while rock climbing, actually, at Stanford. And that was probably the most important serendipitous meeting in my life, because what I got to do during my time at SURF is do exactly what I was hoping to do when coming to Stanford, which is figure out ways to use data to improve things. And so that's sort of the story that brings me here. And that's sort of where I'm going to pick up what my experience was when we began at SURF, because I think there are a lot of misconceptions about what the hard things are and what you can actually do to take all of this awesome research that's happening and bring it out to the real world. And so that's really what this talk is going to be about, is how we can transform that data into better outcomes. So first off, let me just state this, because I believe it very strongly. Doing this work, transforming EHR data into better outcomes, is both hard and worthwhile. And it's something that all of us should be happy to work on. And it's really worth our time to figure out how to go through that whole life cycle, like not just stop at the like, hey, check out my cool new AI's rock curve, but to actually carry it all the way through to having an impact at the end of the day. Even though it's hard, it is very much worth all of our time. And so an example of this is something that we did at SURF. And we did 3 projects there. I'm not going to go into detail about them. I don't want this talk to be just rehashing stuff that's already been published, but the general theme here, an example of using data to improve things, is one of the first papers we did while we were there, which is analyzing preference card data and using that to generate actionable optimizations to save supply cost. And it's the framework here that's interesting for the subject of this particular talk, which is essentially taking EHR data, building an AI algorithm to give out recommendations for changes you can make to the preference card to save cost, and then actually getting the result of a reduction in cost with no reduction in outcomes. So that's sort of the cycle that we want to go better. And there are bazillions of examples of this just within SURF, actually, but just broadly across Stanford. Like, that's a cadence that I think all of us are very familiar with, and it's very much worth taking the time to make this work better. And so that's really what we'll be talking about today. And so during our time there, me and my co-founder Anna, we were both researchers together under David's group, sort of came up with this framework for thinking, okay, how do you make action out of data in a healthcare setting? And really, this is not only to do with healthcare, but breaking it down in this way is helpful in our particular setting for reasons you'll see in just a moment. But generally, the idea is that first off, it's a cycle. So you go through the cycle, and as you learn something, you have a change in the world, you learn from it, and you want to go. So this is a continuous improvement cycle. And generally, everything goes through these 3 core phases, which is collect the data, analyze it, and then act upon it. And one of the fundamental questions here is just, why is this so hard? Like, why does it take forever to go through that cycle and see results in the real world? And what I have found to be just a sort of truism is that there is a common misconception of that this is sort of the distribution of difficulty, where like what we need to do is, go get some, just, query some SQL thing somewhere, get the data set, build our AI or whatever it is that we're publishing off of, and then, try to get somebody to adopt it. But, the hard part is the tech. Like the thing that we're doing here is, figuring out some novel way to analyze the data or a new AI algorithm to solve our woes. And in reality, that's just not how it actually plays out. The hard part is much more distributed on the bookends of this process, getting data that is actually usable, and then getting people to adopt whatever AI or data analysis or whatever it is that we're doing, getting people to adopt it. So those bookends are really the hard part. And that differential has a real cost in terms of throughput and sort of barriers to innovate. So the mismatch at the top means that we often rely on people manually collecting data, or we have to deal with low quality data. Now, a great example of this is anybody who's queried the problem list and tried to like predict something from that. You can't. It's not accurate enough. Like we did some just fun little queries on this early on, and like you'll get crazy things like women are pregnant for 3 years because nobody consistently sets a resolution date in the problem list because there's no incentive to do so. And like you get all kinds of difficult situations where you just can't rely on the EHR data for anything except consistent reflection of billing, or you have someone like a team actually make sure that the data is right, which is a bunch of manual labor anyway. So it's not like the misconception there is that the EHR is this font of knowledge that all you need to do is figure out a way to query it. That's not the case. That's why RegCap exists. And I'm sure all of you have run into that at some point. So essentially you get a choice of low quality data or manual data entry on that front. And that ends up throwing a wrench in all this, which we'll get into a little bit later. The fact that so much effort is put into the AI piece, like really this differential here is just ends up being wasted time. And the problem here, and we'll get to this a little bit when we talk about the change management side of this, but the real problem here is that people will spend a lot of time coming up with a beautiful model that nobody will use because it like puts somebody out of a job, or it, people don't want to hand off that part of their job because they don't trust the computer, or because they don't trust the quality of the data because it's crap. Like it's really hard to get around that problem. So we spend a lot of time building models that end up not being used because these bookends aren't addressed properly. And then the change management piece, this is just project failure. Like if you build something and nobody's going to use it, then might as well not have built it. It's just not useful. And it's a lot better to make sure that we put an appropriate amount of effort up front to address those issues. So that's really the crux of all of this, is we ought to appropriately size all of this. And so in this talk, I'm going to be talking a little bit about data abstraction and change management. And my thesis, and this is coming from someone who spent most of his career like working on AI and cares a lot about it. Like I'm not here to denigrate that at all, but let me just put it this way. If there was a dictator that came along and said, nobody can ever publish another rock curve again, nothing, no new AI, nothing, we freeze it, there would still be 20 decades of work to just roll out what we already have and catch healthcare up to what is already out there in the state of the art today. So I'm not going to talk anything about how to make cool new AI models, even though I care a lot about it because I think it's really cool. We're going to focus on these bookends of how to collect the data and how to drive the change management when everything is done. So the first piece of this is collecting data at scale. So the fundamental problem here is that we need, I'll use this term of art, structured data to do anything useful. And broadly, just what that means is that it's data that computers can understand. So like a good example of this are fire resources, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But the tricky thing is that's not the way that the useful clinical data comes typically. What you'll have are like notes where you're trying to figure out something about the patient and it's been documented in some form or fashion that is not yet ready to just drop into an AI model. So the way to think about this is like, if you're trying to feed your model for training, you need this, you have this arrow needs to be implemented somehow. And that's really the barrier for what I was calling data abstraction before, just collecting structured data that is reliable, is this arrow. And so all of you are familiar with the sort of state of the art for doing this. If you want to make a research project, chances are you're using RegCap. It's a great product that you can go and build your own forms and collect things in a structured manner that you can then drop into table one, or you can go and build your AI model on it, or whatever it is that you need. That's the way that it's done today. And that's the way I kind of want everyone to conceptualize this, is like getting structured data means very tactically filling out some sort of form, which in turn is derived from some sort of data definition. So structured data equals a form to fill out at the end of the day. And the current state is that you have two really bad options, basically. One, you can go get some nurses to type the data in, or worse, the actual PIs in the project, which happens pretty often, to go do some chart dives and like fill out RegCap or Excel or what have you to produce the data that's useful. So that's sort of option number one. And option number two is to go and query the EHR's existing structured data and use like, SQL or FHIR or some other approach to pull that out. And they have some really big challenges though. The manual abstraction, I think this is kind of obvious, but basically like having people fill out forms all day is not ideal for a lot of reasons. It's time consuming, it's expensive, it's a waste of our clinical talent, which is in really stark contrast right now because we've got such a shortage of that right now. It's slow, it's boring, there's long latency. So back again to the change management piece, like say that you're building a model that needs real-time data to make decisions, like sepsis is a classic example of that. You can't wait for a data abstraction team to spend 3 weeks catching up on the data. It just doesn't work. You need it in real time. So that's a problem too. But there's a huge benefit, which is why this is still sort of the core state of the art here, is accurate. So you can get people making clinical calls. It's trustworthy data. That means that the models you train off of it are by extension trustworthy, or as trustworthy as the data that's collected. And there are really great techniques for like measuring how accurate it is, like iterator reliability and things like this. So that's like something that you can get good data out of, and that's why there's so much of this done today. The EHR structured data has other different problems. It's typically incomplete. So like just some real life examples from us, like we wanted to build a model to predict length of stay in the CVICU on the children's side. And a very obvious thing you need for that is, are they a heart failure patient or not? Just like you need that. And long story short, you can't get that from the structured data for the patients that are currently in the hospital. So it's just like very tactically, you can't go and query the EHR for the data you need. There's even more complicated things about like, you have the CPT code for tetralogy of Fallot repair, but you need very specifically, was it with a transannular patch or was it a unifocalization or what was it? And the granularity of the data just isn't good enough for the research project at hand. So just broadly, it's incomplete generally. Also, it has a problem of inaccuracy, as I was mentioned before. The problem lists are a classic example of this. Also, you have to ask IT for the data set, which can add many months of time because they're super busy. So like you have to put in your data request, wait for 6 months, that delays the whole project and makes it really hard to scale. It's not comparable across sites, like one Epic instance is one Epic instance. If the query works at your site, it won't necessarily work elsewhere, it often will not work elsewhere, et cetera. Also, the EHRs make it really difficult. Like I think probably everyone has experience there, but that's a sort of unnecessary but real barrier that's there. And it still requires data entry. And this is one of the things that I find that I really want to nail home here, because I think a lot of folks are just like, well, we should just have better smart forms or whatever so that we get more accurate data. So back to my tetralogy flow example, how about when like the post-operative documentation has a smart form that has a drop-down menu that has all of the kinds of tetralogy flow repair, and they pick that. Like all that you're doing there is adding data abstraction burden to the front line, which is the last thing we want to do. I'm not saying smart forms don't have a place. They absolutely have a place, but that's not solving the problem that we're talking about here. It's like, it's just kicking the problem to another place. Instead of doing it downstream with abstractors reading the notes, you're doing it up front in the required provider documentation. So like, it's just moving the source of the problem around, which is, does not mean it's not a valuable thing to do in certain situations, but it's not like solving the problem that we're talking about here. So, and again, one of the core things here is that most of the data is in notes. So it doesn't matter if you get all the data in the EHR delivered to you on a platter, you can't make the query like, give me my heart failure patients. It just doesn't exist. So, but the good things about it are that it's repeatable and the collection cycle is fast, or relatively fast. So like it can be as fast as real time if it's a FHIR query, or have like a day latency in the case of like clarity and things like that. So, so that's sort of the current state of the art. You get two really bad choices. One, we go get the team to type data into RegCap. The other is that we go and query the current state of the EHR, which probably isn't going to solve our problem. So, ta-da! Well, let's AI to the rescue. Like, let's do you know, digital workers, AI, whatever, to do this. And I just went into Google Scholar and typed this stuff in. Like, there are tens of thousands of papers on the subject. And long story short, I'll just summarize all of this for you as it works. Basically, like you can go, you can get NLP, and you can go like you could do this. And there are a bunch of papers that sort of prove this. Like, long story short, these exist, the results are compelling, and all of you would believe it if you go do a lit review. So there's a pretty natural question of, okay, where is it? Like, this isn't something I can just go and grab. Where is it? If there's all, this has been around for a long time. And the answer is really subtle and very interesting. And that's because of the way that all of those, like if you take each of those research papers, again, this is me doing a like hyper meta analysis on these things, but you'll find this framework applies unilaterally across all these different projects that have been done. These research projects are laid out like this, where you go and you collect a truth data set, they build and iterate on the model, they evaluate it against the truth data set to check out its performance, usually as an iterator reliability measure, comparing against the truth data set that was again collected manually in RegCap or whatever, just like we talked about. Then they'll publish, and then hopefully, but not necessarily, operationalize it. And the typical budget, the very specific number here is like 566K is the average NIH grant. But like, point is, order of magnitude 500K is how much it costs to do that whole endeavor. And a key here, though, is like, as all of you know, clinical documentation varies widely, even within an organization. So if you do this at Stanford and you spend your 500K to do this, that does not mean that it's going to go work if you just roll it out at UCSF or Common Spirit or like some other group. It's just not going to work. The worst part, though, and the most insidious part, is some of it will and some of it won't. And you don't know which of those things is going to work until you go do this at those different sites. So you're back to like, oh, look, it cost me 500K because I have to go start. Like, you're not starting entirely from scratch, but you do have to go do data abstraction, build and iterate the model, et cetera, to replicate the results. So this is why you can't just go and grab one of those AI models off of Google Scholar and solve your abstraction problems. That's really the heart of it. And there's a lot of detail here. I'm going to send you all the slide here so you can sort of walk through it with me. But like, long story short, the ROI here doesn't pan out. Like, if you went and wanted to pitch one of your, like, you know, the budget committee, hey, let's go do AI abstraction for CAT-PCI or STS or like one of the registries or our research project or whatever, this is the spreadsheet you put together, and it just don't work out like the way that it pans out. Essentially, you can save, like in my example here, on average, it's again a lit review sort of thing. On average, people do like 10 fields of the form that I mentioned, which is usually 10 concepts, like figuring out hypertension or whatever it is they're doing. And typically 9 out of 10 of them will succeed insofar as it was able to replicate the manual labor. And so, but each field, if you go in time and abstract or doing it, each field takes on average 30 seconds. That's a number we know because of the work for the company, but like, that's just the number you can sort of keep as a ballpark number. Each field takes about 30 seconds for an abstractor to do. If we assume about $100 an hour fully loaded of nurse time, like, long story short, you get that the most ROI you can get is about $7,500 a year, and you just spent 500K to build it. So it doesn't work. And that's really what has been the huge barrier here for using NLP and other sort of technologies to solve the data collection problem, is this math. And it turns out that, like, if you do a sensitivity analysis on this, like, you half the budget or you double the amount of time saved or whatever, you still get something that is at best like a payback period of 20 years, which just doesn't work. You can't go and pitch that to your CFO. So it turns out that the way you can solve this is to sort of subtly change the way that these projects are rolled out. Choose an existing data abstraction problem where people are already building a truth data set because it's recurring. Registries are a great example of this, but that's not the only one. So choose something where you already have abstractors doing the work, and then add a constraint to your model that the model can learn from those abstractors' work. What that lets you do is continuously roll out the model when it proves itself. So you need to build an evaluation framework where in real time, as abstractors do the work, it compares it against the digital workers. And only when it passes a certain threshold do you go and actually roll it out into production. And what that does is it changes the ROI significantly, because looking at this from a differential perspective, you're already spending the time on the data abstraction cost, so you can just strike that. The sort of overhead tax is not the like research tax is not there because it's not research. This is like operationalized already. And so what you're left with is this 25K of model building. And basically you'll get and also crucially, this approach works across sites because it's a learning model. So it's going to learn from the data at a new site as well. And basically when you do make those changes to the equation, what you'll figure out is that essentially the payback period is 3.3 years in my little example here for a given site. But again, this scales across sites. So every time you add a site, you can drop it down. And like a good sort of ballpark rule of thumb is that if the payback period is a year, that's like something worth investing in. So essentially what the conclusions you get there, doing that is difficult, first off. So that's why like this hasn't already existed. It's hard, but it can be done. And the other thing is that to get a less than a year payback, you still need multiple sites. And so like, long story short, I'm sort of walking through my story here about how to solve this. That's why we started the company, not because I want to do a startup. I think that's way overglorified. Like we did this because in order to reach that threshold of having a year payback period, you've got to do it at multiple sites. And one way to do that is with the company. Another way to do that is with a like research collaborative. And there's a lot of different ways of doing that. But this was the most practical way of doing it. And that's kind of how this all can happen. So that's where we sort of went from being researchers, and then that's where the company started. And that's all I'm going to talk about with the company. Essentially, we built a product to do this as the sort of Cliff Notes version of this, which obviously I can talk about ad nauseum, but I don't want to like spend too much of your time doing that here. But the key is that by building a product that checks all those boxes, learns from the institution's data, allows real-time feedback, and interjects the model's ideas only when they've proven themselves, you can sort of upend the ROI equation, and suddenly all of those papers, what they've done becomes operationalizable. So that's really the heart of it. And we did some proof of concepts early on just to prove out this concept. We picked 55 fields and impact, and like long story short, you can get this approach gives you a 70% reduction in labor, and it actually improves the quality and everything like that. So like long story short, those results that you'll find in the papers can pan out in this world. The difference is that the ROI equation is 2 orders of magnitude better with that sort of approach. So that's sort of the idea about collecting data. And then finally, and I'll breeze through this because I want to make sure I leave plenty of time for questions because I'm much more interested in hearing from you guys instead of hearing myself talk. We'll breeze through this, but a key piece to this is, okay, like now we've collected data and now we need to act upon it. What are the sort of barriers there? And back to my earlier slide, I think this is the hardest part. And it's also a little harder to talk about this problem generically because it matters a lot what space you're in. Like, are you trying to make a change to the clinical pathway for a patient, or is it like back end office sort of stuff, and like the change management in those different, they're very different worlds. But there's some sort of key highlights at a high level that I want to sort of discuss just to sort of set the stage a little bit, that are true across any sort of data-driven improvement in healthcare is true for. So the first challenge is comparable data. Again, one EHR instance is one EHR instance. Like no matter what you do, in order to do at scale a sort of change management thing. So like back to my example before, say you've built a model that can right size people's preference cards using AI. And your goal is to roll that out in as many hospitals as possible because it, by the, according to the results of the paper, should reduce the cost by 20%. So that's like something that is worth our time to go do because it's very expensive and it'd be a good way to save cost of the health system. So now what we want to do is not just do it at Stanford, we want to do it at every hospital. So what's the first challenge you're going to run into? Well, that's comparable data. So that means that whatever mechanism you use to collect the data at hospital site A is equivalent to hospital site B. And there's a lot of overlap between the sort of change management side of this and the data collection piece, but it's a little bit different because and like one of the key things I want to sort of address here is I think there's a lot of hope amongst folks that interoperability standards are going to solve this. So like let's say that we wave a magic wand and everybody has a fully implemented FHIR R4 endpoint that is easily accessible and is not impossible to get through your governance committee. That's a lot of assumptions. Let's just say that that's the world we live in. What's going to happen? Like, is that going to solve the apples to oranges problem, or like how far down the road does that get us? So here's the key. What you want is something very specific. Back to my tetralogy of flow example, like I want the very specific CPT code that tells me what kind of tetralogy of flow repair it has. What you're going to get out of FHIR, if again, you wave the magic wand and it's available everywhere, what you're going to get today is something that looks like this, where you've got the procedure log and the procedure code. And this is not like, you may think this is an exaggeration. I'm telling you, the procedure logs at hospitals out there, Stanford's is fairly clean, but there's even some of this there. There'll be things like a foot surgery in there, or just stuff that is not helpful to when you look at it. So, and that's like what it actually looks like in real life. And the reason for that is nobody really cares. Like there's not often an organizational priority to have a clean documentation of a procedure before it's happened, especially. You use the internal procedure codes for that. And the primary thing that needs to do is drive the setup and like make sure that the right team is engaged and stuff beforehand. And then way afterwards, after the bill is cut, you'll get a CPT code or something more specific. But this is what you're going to get if you just go and like go to some random hospital and query their FHIR API. So that doesn't solve the problem. How can you fix it? Well, ta-da, we're back to data abstraction. Basically, you join this information with notes with the model, and you can get out structured data. But unfortunately, that's data abstraction again. But so this box here, just drop in everything that I just said about data abstraction earlier on, and that's how you sort of solve it. So, but the point is like the FHIR is not going to solve this. Like you're going to end up having to drop in a like architectural block of data abstraction in there regardless, and that's not going to solve the apples to oranges problem. The only thing you can do is set. So essentially, the key here is that the interop standards are only as good as your input data. That's really the sort of Cliff Note version of that. And so one key takeaway, that this is its own topic in a much longer conversation, I'm just going to leave this at bullet point level. Looking at what registries have done, they're one of the best examples of apples to apples comparable data across institutions. They're not perfect, but they're the best we've got right now in terms of finding deep clinical data that is comparable across sites. And there's a lot of lessons to learn there. Specifically, like you need to put a lot of work in advance on the data collection standards and definitions, and then make sure that that's a scalable endeavor, which gets back to data abstraction, which gets back to the first half of my talk. So the key takeaway here, though, is that learning from registries is a real key to solving that problem. So, so the solution is to start with the data model, make sure that everyone is collecting exactly the same form at the different institutions, learn from the registries in terms of how to quality control that, and then you have apples to apples sort of comparisons. So, and the second challenge, which is I think if there's only one thing that everyone walks away with out of this talk, I want it to be these like two very high level slides. I think it's easy to get excited about what AI can do, and that's because it can do a lot of great things, and that excitement is not unwarranted. That also means that there's a lot of time spent building things that nobody's ever going to use, and those are all tragedies. And they're preventable tragedies is the thing. So if you build it, they will they probably will not come. That is just a truism, but one that is too often overlooked. And I believe very strongly that you should learn from the Wizard of Oz. So start with a fake that if people had it, they're happy, and then go do all of the build. So like for instance, if you built, if you're building you want to use AI to optimize the preference card workflow, for instance, back to my paper example. The right way to start that is to give people a few preference cards that you went through by hand and figured out, like what I did. I sat there in a few hundred procedures, me and my co-founder and a couple other folks on the team, there are 4 of us, sat in about 100 procedures of the same type, looked to see what was actually used, and then gave a report. Like that, it was good for a lot of reasons, and it took a lot less time than going out and collecting the data downstream. And we already knew up front that people wanted that report that we produced because it was actionable and people wanted it. So that's like something that is a lot cheaper to do. Sit there, shadow people, compute things by hand, fake it, figure out some way to fake it before you go down this rabbit hole of collecting data, because it's hard, it's going to take forever. And it's very likely that what you do there, nobody's going to use. Like, I'm not telling you about the other 10 projects that we thought about doing that turned out that for change management purposes, they just wouldn't happen. Like, and there are so many reasons that people would not use your project that are not going to be obvious to you until you do this. It could be you're putting somebody out of a job. Like, yeah, maybe AI can do that, but are you going to be the one to go and like go to that team and be like, yeah, we don't need you anymore, we've got an algorithm for that? No, that's not how it works. It will never happen. And you got to figure out some way to at least give them something else to do along the way. So like, spend your time where it matters. That's in the change management. Like, okay, you aren't willing to take this report about making the preference cards more actionable because there's the make preference cards better team that this would be taking their job away. Well, how can we support that team instead? Like, what changes can we make to keep them in place, keep their leadership there, but not get them as people who try to kill the project, for instance. Like, and that didn't happen, but just saying it could. And it probably would at other institutions that I'm sure have. I mean, I know for a fact it's like a job description that you can be like a preference card manager. So you don't want to be the one putting them out of a job, because that gets you somebody who will try to kill the project, and that makes the whole thing not work. So anyway, point is, start with the fake, then figure out what does your model need to do? Like, what are the performance requirements for it? All this sort of stuff. Because if it turns out that like a simple, quick, like regular expression search of the notes is going to get you there, then do that. Why go and like, build some crazy new natural language processing algorithm to do what it is that you're trying to do? Like, just start and only do what you need to ship that UX that drove the change that you're going after. And then you can build the model, and then you scale out the data collection, because that last part, again, back to the first half of my talk, is the hardest part, and it's going to be expensive no matter what you do. So don't worry about that until you know all the rest of it is going to work. So again, if there's only one takeaway for this whole talk, I wanted it to be this one slide, so I'm just going to leave it up when I switch to questions. Change management is always the hardest part in any like data-driven outcomes improvement project out there. De-risk that first, and you're setting yourself up for success. Otherwise, it may be very disappointing when you build the world's coolest model and nobody uses it. So with that is my talk. And thanks again for everyone listening. And I would love to take questions or discuss anything that you guys would like.
Well, great. First of all, let's all give you the virtual applause in this virtual world. Fascinating talk. Really enjoyed it. There are a couple of questions in chat. I'm going to start out with one that may just be clarifying for people.
Sure.
Yes. Could you leave that last one up? That's exactly what my question is about. So I think that you will find many people on this call who have been through this process of trying to figure out what it is that people really want and need, and start building something that affects that. And it's not so straightforward to figure out what people really want and need. Could you give an example of both a yes and a no decision after step one in the green column?
Yes,
So
good question. Let me think of, okay, so first off, let me put a plug in for SURF here as well. So the world's greatest authority on this that I know of is David Schenker, who can give you hundreds of examples of this at this point, and he's very cogent and will be very helpful. So if someone is like doing this in real life, I'll give you some examples and put this in context here, but he is, I mean, he was my mentor on all this, and he's still very, very good at this. So I would highly, highly recommend it. He loves talking about this. So if you reach out to them, he will be happy to do it. So anyway, and if anybody needs his contact information, I'll be happy to volunteer because I know he wants to talk.
As you know, he's given a talk in this series before, but I do urge people to reach out to him if they like. Go ahead.
Absolutely. Good. So back to this. So an example of where this worked is what I was talking about with the preference card work, for instance. Like so what we did there specifically, as I mentioned, we did an old school like approach. So it's actually a really good place to figure out a way to fake this is to emulate what consultants do, because most like preference card projects, for instance, the sort of state of the art for that is to go hire like, well, I was about to use names. Let's not use names because I don't want to like throw people under the bus because they do good work. So I don't mean to like say they're out of date or something because they do helpful stuff. But a consulting group that goes out and like specializes in whatever it is that you're doing, because chances are those exist, and go and like talk to people who did one of those projects. So that's what we did. There'd been about 2 years prior to when we kicked off the project under SURF, there'd been a like preference card refresh project where they consulted with another consulting firm to do that work. And generally, if that's something that consultants do, then there's a good chance that you can probably replicate it and make the UX changes that you'd like. And so that's a good place to start. And that's a case of where this worked really well. And also, like by going after stuff where other people have had success already, that's a really good way to get started. So that's not always an option, but when it is, definitely exercise it because it'll save you a bunch of time. People can tell you what worked and what didn't up front. So that's how we sort of settled on that approach for like going in and just doing what the consultants do exactly and figuring out where we can capture data along the way to inform the later like steps in the cycle. So some examples that this didn't work, I could because it was done at your specific institution, let me like not, I'm going to speak at a high level here. I'll tell you sort of bullet points. And because again, like these are all, they're all real reasons. It just, they won't become obvious. So like say that you build something that is meaningfully replicating a workflow that is currently being executed by a person. A reason that could fail is I don't want to lose my job, right? And that is a real effect with anything that is using AI that should be carefully controlled against. What I don't like is like, I think it's easy for people to be like, well, you know, they shouldn't be holding us back and like get on a soapbox about that. Like it's people's livelihoods. You don't want to go around and like, you know, kick people out of jobs. And that is one of the biggest like things that's going to come from a lot of this is that because the work that is being done here is by its nature important, like you're not going to pick stuff that doesn't matter. That means somebody's solving it right now. And you got to like worry about what the effect of solving it in a different way is going to be. So that's part of the reason why I'm so adamant about the Wizard of Oz sort of thing, is that that's the only way you're going to shake these things out effectively, is do this and see who gets angry, like just bluntly, because it will happen. And they're legitimate concerns and should be addressed up front. So I would say like every variant that I saw fail and to get past that first step was because of that piece. It's like you're encroaching in somebody's territory and they don't want it taken away. And especially early on, it's not even clear if that's a good idea to take it away from them yet, for instance. And so what's better is to find cases where like maybe somebody quit recently that like has been doing something really important and figure out a way to take that over with this, with the new process, or, you know, find actual hard pain points to solve for first and make sure that nobody is working on it who you would displace. That would be my primary piece of advice there.
Okay.
Yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
I'm sure there's much more to say about it. There is a question in the chat that's very, very concrete. Any thoughts on Epic Smart data elements? It may force entry at the front line, but has better data collection strategy. How is perhaps that's different than your prior example?
Yes, great question. And sort of what I was alluding to early on, like I think there are very legitimate use cases for this, where, for instance, okay, so first let me take a step back for the goals here. I believe the goal is that everything is only ever documented once. Like if somebody wrote it in a note, don't force the and consistently writes it in a note, and like that, you don't have to worry about data quality on that regard, or making a tweak to the note template would be more comfortable for people. Like if it's there, then the other techniques that I was mentioning before, like reading through the notes, et cetera, are better and more scalable. And like that, because again, like a smart form created at institution A is not going to be available to institution B. And I believe very strongly that the goal that all of this should be driving toward is that these awesome data interventions that we build work not only at the institution in which they were sort of realized. So that I believe is the goal, that you never duplicate, like require people to type up their note that has everything that every doc ever needs, and then go fill out this form over here to satisfy some reporting requirement or whatever, which is a pure function, albeit a complex one, of the data that was documented in the notes. So I believe that to be the goal, is to not require that to happen, and that it's scalable so that it works everywhere. Smart forms still have a very important role to play insofar as there are lots of things that don't break either of those tenets. Like for instance, if I'll give a clinical trial example, like say that you're trialing a new drug, and one of the things you need to collect about the patient consistently is, was this new drug that has no record of any existence anywhere because it doesn't technically exist yet, has the patient taken this drug, yes or no? And it may be that wasn't documented in the standard operating procedure. This is a kind of stupid example. Actually, a better example would be medical devices, actually, because that's much more likely to not be captured as effectively. So like the presence or absence of a medical device, people may not be used to looking for it. It may be missed. And so having a smart form that pops up at the right time that asks like, hey, did you use this? Yes or no? Well, at the very least, require them to go dig and figure out if it's there, because it probably wasn't documented consistently in the notes. A bad example of this is like cath PCI needs to know if there was an arrhythmia that happened after our PCI procedure. Like, let's pop up a smart form on discharge that requires somebody to fill that out. That's a bad one because that's documented all over the place. Nobody's going to miss that. Like that's going to be a duplicated effort. So I guess my key point here is make sure that we use that in a way that does not increase the documentation burden unnecessarily, where to me unnecessarily is that it's been documented consistently in any form elsewhere in the EHR. That's really the key there.
Thank you. Another question in the chat is, as part of work with any large health systems like the VA or Kaiser that you're allowed to talk about? A couple of people want to know the answer to that question.
Yes, and I wonder what I'm allowed to talk about. Yes, I'm pretty sure I can say it. Can I say this? So like Common Spirit, for instance, one of our customers that uses the platform. So the biggest customer. The smallest is a clinic of like it's the small hospital with 200 beds. So like we've run the gambit in terms of the size. And long story short, this can scale and is in some ways it's kind of interesting because a lot of approaches don't work equally well on both ends of the spectrum, and this one does. Like long story short, it's it makes it work anyway, which is pretty cool. So
thanks. Yeah, Lisa or Monique, do you want to expand further on why it was interesting to you to know the answer to that question?
Go ahead, Monique. Yeah, actually, you know, because I have a engineering background, I'm always kind of looking at market proof of concept, because there's a lot that you can learn when you're actually working with healthcare systems. I guess another question that I had, and you know, this might be a slightly naive question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, is sort of using this approach to actually gain insights into potential health equity risks that are embedded in clinical care delivery.
Oh, that's a great. So there are, that is a big topic, and I which I care about a lot. I'm trying to like, I think, so let me just start off with what I think is probably obvious, but is sort of the heart of the issue here. I think if we don't collect the data that we need to know about analyzing that in the first place, then it's not going to happen. And that's a data abstraction task, and therefore, like, you need to do everything that I mentioned in order to get at the data that is useful. That's really the heart of the issue, I think, right now, is that I think a lot of it's hard to collect the data with enough statistics, just partially because of one of the things that underlies the whole premise of making sure that we're equitable is that we want to make sure that smaller segments of the population are not underserved, essentially, which by extension means that reaching statistics where you can compare inherently noisy data is hard. And so I believe that this is a combination of two things. It's a what is the right thing to do in the first place question, which is a much longer topic, but also a very just like fits nicely into what I was talking about. Like the hardest thing is data collection. It's a data collection problem too, because often you need people to go through and like infer things from notes at scale, and that's just really hard to do with good enough statistics to see any effects. So I think it's a combination of both of those things, and that all the stuff we've been talking about could make a meaningful impact as long as it's rolled out in sort of the same way that I was advocating before, I think. So
Thanks,
that's a great question.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's been a lot of concern, of course, in the world as a whole, but even in medicine, about whether AI is just replicating biases that might exist out there. And I think it's, as you pointed out, both a data collection problem and an analytic problem. You have to choose the right gold standard, in other words. I think we are probably at time. We usually try and leave people about 5 minutes so that they can do something else besides stare at their computer screen for 5 minutes, including you, Matt. And so we're so grateful that you were willing to take the time to tell us about this fascinating work. I know that many people here may want to contact you. I hope you'd be open to that. And I myself might take advantage of that.
Awesome.
Pleasure hearing from you. And thank you so much.
Thank you all. It's a pleasure to talk to you. And again, don't hesitate to reach out. My contact information is here, and happy to chat anytime. Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.